Criminal justice is the first area that our fairness, transparency, and accountability work started on at PAI, and it continues to be an area of really deep research and insights for us. So our criminal justice report was our first PAI research output and multi-stakeholder project. And in this report, we examined the use of risk assessment tools in the pretrial context within the United States. And we chose criminal justice as the focal point for this initial report, since this is arguably the highest stakes context where machine learning is being deployed. And we wanted to highlight the importance of these fairness, transparency, and accountability issues. So this report seeks to represent the viewpoint of the partnership in establishing 10 minimum requirements for the responsible deployment of these sorts of tools. But the conclusion of our report was that no tool currently meets all 10 of these requirements. So following on to that work, we also did research specifically relevant to the current pandemic and the use of the pattern risk assessment tool by the Bureau of Prisons to start determining who should be prioritized for release from prison into home confinement. And our research in this space highlighted the potential for pattern to amplify existing racial disparities, and also how pattern was not trained to account for a pandemic environment and not trained to account for different trade-offs with health risks that are especially relevant when making these sorts of sensitive decisions. And finally, ongoing work in this space includes research specifically on statistical methods for measuring and mitigating algorithmic bias in arrest data. So we're looking at how can we use multiple sources of data, particularly data on both victimization and arrest, to get a better sense of various sources of bias within these data sets. And also we're doing continued research in the risk assessment space to examine how different sorts of interventions that have been proposed can or cannot reduce bias in these tools. So our two research fellows in this space, Ricardo Fogliato and Alexandra Choldachova, will be going into much greater depth about these projects. And Alex is an assistant professor of statistics and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and Ricardo is a PhD student in statistics at Carnegie Mellon as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Choldachova, and I'll be co-presenting today with Ricardo Fogliato. Both of us are currently research fellows of the Partnership on AI, where I'm also faculty at Carnegie Mellon University, and Ricardo is a PhD student in the Statistics and Data Science Department. In this talk, we'll be sharing some of the recent work we've been doing as part of PAI's criminal justice projects. So as many of you know, criminal risk assessment instruments are used throughout the criminal justice system to inform a range of consequential outcomes, from pretrial decisions on who gets released and under what conditions, to sentencing, to correctional programming. In the correctional context specifically, accurate assessments of risk have long been viewed as important considerations in targeting risk-reducing interventions. More recently, there's been significant concern that risk assessment instruments may be racially biased by virtue of being trained to predict racially biased measures of criminal outcomes using input features that themselves suffer from racial bias. One issue, as has been articulated in many statements of concern, is that these tools do not directly predict who is likely to reoffend. Rather, they predict who's likely to be rearrested or, in some cases, convicted. This is problematic because, at least in the case of low severity offenses, such as low-level drug offenses, there's evidence that Blacks are considerably more likely to be arrested than whites, despite reporting using drugs at similar rates. Of course, criminal history is not the only type of information that goes into risk assessment instruments and downstream decisions. A lot of other data and information factors in as well. But our work has largely been focused on better understanding racial disparities in arrest data and how this impacts the algorithmic bias of resulting risk assessment tools. In this talk, we'll describe some of the work we've done framed in the context of the pattern risk assessment tool developed for use by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And then we'll touch on some new directions we're pursuing in this research. For some background, in response to the COVID pandemic, in late March of this year, Attorney General William Barr issued a memo stating that the BOP, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, should seek to transfer eligible inmates into home confinement. The memo states, however, that only those inmates who score a minimum score on the pattern risk assessment should be prioritized for this type of transfer. In response to this memo, we wrote an issue brief in which we articulated 4 concerns with the proposed strategy. First, we argue that pattern was not developed or validated for the use case proposed in this memo. Pattern was not developed to predict recidivism for those transferred to home confinement earlier in the sentence, nor does pattern take into consideration today's economic and social conditions which could influence outcomes. Furthermore, the set of stakeholders engaged in the process of developing pattern in the first place did not have the opportunity to weigh in on the specific use case of the tool, and their preferences may be quite different from what they expressed for the proposed use case initially. Second, pattern does not account for clinically relevant factors. So prioritization based on pattern could result in many inmates with pre-existing health conditions that might make them more susceptible to COVID not being prioritized for transfer on the basis of a non-minimum pattern score. And our investigation, indeed, we found that the large weight placed on age would make up to 20% of the inmate population ineligible for prioritization based on age alone. Most of our issue brief, however, focuses on concerns 3 and 4. These are that there are large racial disparities in the assessed levels of risk, and that the criminal history elements of risk are largely driven by past low-level offenses. As Ricardo will further discuss, one of the key issues is that while pattern does have separate scales for assessing risk of violent and general recidivism, the final risk level aggregates across those 2 scales. And this raises the concern that using pattern and trading off between risk to public safety and the inmate's well-being disproportionately weighs low-level offenses against potentially severe health complications. Furthermore, because racial disparities in arrests are suspected to be higher for low-level offenses, which make up the bulk of arrest, this reliance not only weighs the wrong public safety risks, but also does so in a manner that may disadvantage non-white inmates who are more likely to be arrested for those low-level crimes. Ricardo will take it from here and describe more of the details of our work.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, I'm Riccardo Fogliato, and I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon. So, as Alex mentioned, we are largely interested in understanding the role of racial disparities in arrest data and how they impact the training and evaluation of risk assessment instruments. This entails analyzing how these phenomena shape the data that we observe. And in our work, we focus on racial disparities in violent offenses. So past work has suggested that arrest for violent offenses could be an unbiased and valid proxy for violent criminal offending across racial groups. And this argument mainly builds on the fact that arrests for violent offenses are typically the product of reactive rather than proactive policing. This means that for the most part, violent offenses are reported to police. And we can imagine that if the likelihood of arrest did not depend on the characteristics of a crime, of the offender and of a victim, then this type of arrest data will well reflect the underlying distribution of violent offenses. Furthermore, they are used both as a predictor and a target in the training and assessment of risk assessment instruments could be well justified. In our work, we study whether the likelihood of arrest for a violent offender depends on their race. But first, let's look at this illustrative figure to better understand how a violent offense might eventually lead to an arrest. As I just mentioned, there are 2 ways in which an offense might become known to the police. First, it can be found proactively, for instance, by patrolling. But as I said, this is very rare. In most cases, the victim or some other third party decide whether to report the offense or not. And only if they decide to report it, then the offense becomes known to the police. At this point, an arrest may or may not happen. Therefore, arrests represent a subset of all offenses that are known to the police, which in turn are also a subset of all offenses that have been committed. So how can we analyze the likelihood of reporting and arrests and how they shape the data that we observe in police records? We studied this research question by analyzing 2 separate datasets. The first dataset comes from the Nationally Incident-Based Reporting System, known as NIBERS, and contains offense-level data for most of the offenses that are reported to police agencies. In this data, we study whether the likelihood of arrest varies across racial groups for those incidents that are known to the police, and also that have been reported to the FBI through this program. And to better understand which offenses are reported to police, we also look at another dataset obtained from the National Crime Victimization Survey Program, known as NCVS. This dataset contains data on victimizations, and for each of them, we know whether the corresponding offense was reported or not to the police. By integrating information from victimization with records of official arrest, we can better understand how the likelihood of police notification varies across types of offenses. And importantly, we can also study how the likelihood of arrest for all offenses that have been committed, rather than only for the incidents that are known to the police. In our analysis, we found that among those incidents that are known to the police, white offenders tend to be more likely to be arrested. Incidents with white offenders are typically less likely to be known to the police, and the likelihood of arrest overall is generally higher for white offenders, but it also largely varies with the type of crime. The main takeaway of our analysis is that arrests for violent offenses do not absolutely reflect the underlying distribution of violent offenses, and it is very unlikely that they also represent an unbiased proxy for arrests. Then, how can we translate these findings into the development and assessment of risk assessment instruments? Indeed, risk assessment instruments, as Alex has already said, are trained on rearrest and not on reoffense data. And we have assessed that the likelihood of arrest greatly varies with the characteristics of a crime. The use of conviction data would still be very much problematic given the large discretion that is granted to judges. And in past work, we have developed some sensitivity analysis approach to analyze the impact of these racial disparities in the data with respect to reoffense. But there, we assumed no knowledge of a form of such racial disparities in the unobserved data. And now, in the coming months, we will be working on the development and assessment of these tools, assuming that we have some knowledge of such racial disparities. Specifically, we want to understand how we could develop instruments that show desirable properties, not only with respect to rearrest, but also with respect to reoffense data. And that's all. Thank you.